What caused American colonists in the 1760s and 1770s to become so emphatic about the cause of liberty? The chief reason for their discontent in these years was a dramatic change in Britain's colonial policy. Britain began to assert its power in the colonies, to collect taxes, to enforce trade laws, much more boldly and aggressively than in the past. A lot of the reason why Britain took these steps was because of their wars for empire that took place late in the 17th century. There's actually a series of wars that Britain fought with France and Spain, both in Europe and in the colonies. Each one was worldwide in scope, and the stakes were incredibly high because the winner of the struggle stood to gain supremacy in the West Indies, in North America, so in what is today the United States and what is today Canada, and to dominate that colonial trade overseas. King William's War is the first of three wars, and it's in both this war and the war after it, which was called Queen Anne's War. The English launched expeditions to try to capture Quebec. Quebec up here belonging to France. Their efforts failed. It's during King William's War and Queen Anne's War that the Native Americans allied themselves with the French. Native Americans were supported by the French, and they would burn a lot of English frontier settlements. This gave the Native Americans an opportunity to get the British out of North America because the French were a much more cooperative ally for the American Indians because they're a lot more spread out than the British, so they're not really pushing the American Indians off their land as much. In King William's War, the English forces will eventually prevail, and then in Queen Anne's War, they'll gain both Nova Scotia from France, so here, and they'll also get trading rights in Spanish America. In the mid-18th century, so 1740s, there's a third war that's fought during the reign of King George II, so they call it King George's War. Once again, the British colonies were under attack from the French and the Spanish. And as a result of this war, Britain agrees to give Louisbourg, back to the French. In exchange, Britain will get political and economic gains in India, so on the other side of the world. Those who lived in New England, especially the British colonists who live in New England, are very furious about the loss of Fort Louisbourg because they had worked so hard to gain it. Then we get to a fourth war that will take place in the 1750s. So those first three wars, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, in summary, they really focused primarily on battles in Europe, and it's only secondarily focused on conflict in the colonies. The European powers saw little value in committing regular troops to America. But in the fourth and final war, this French and Indian War, the fighting actually began in the colonies and then spread to Europe. England and France now recognized the full importance of their colonies, and they would start sending large numbers of troops overseas to North America rather than relying only on colonial forces, which were sort of seen as amateur. The French and Indian War is different in the colonies than it is in Europe. In Europe, they call it the 7 Years' War. From the British point of view, the French really provoked the war because they built a series of forts in the Ohio River Valley, which was highly desirable land. One of the reasons why the French built those forts was to really halt the growth of the British colonies. The British were starting to spread from just being on the coast into this Ohio River Valley where the French really dominated the fur trade. So The British were hoping that they could help the French, or stop the French, from completing work on forts in the Ohio River Valley. So they sent George Washington, who at that point was just a colonel, to stop the French from building this fort. But the French, who have allied, remember, with the American Indians, attacked George Washington, and Washington's troops are they're kind of repulsed back, looking for more help. After gaining kind of a small initial victory, Washington's troops will have to surrender to this superior force of Frenchmen and their American Indian allies. And that happens in 1754. So then the war is really starting off kind of bad for the British. There's another guy named General Braddock. He's from Virginia. He'll lead a force in the French and Indian War in an effort to sort of push the French back and out of the Ohio River Valley. But he will suffer a lot of defeats in the early part of the war. The Algonquin allies of the French really ravaged the frontier from western Pennsylvania all the way down to North Carolina. The British tried to invade Canada in 1756, and they were repulsed, so they were not able to obtain Canada. So in the middle of the war, or really in the beginning, it starts and then it's implemented later, Britain recognizes the need for coordinating a colonial defense. So the British government called for representatives from several of the colonies to meet in a congress at Albany, New York. The delegates from 7 colonies adopted this Albany Plan of Union. It's created by Benjamin Franklin, and it provided for an intercolonial government and a system of recruiting troops, collecting taxes in the various colonies, all for their common defense. Unfortunately, each colony, as you see in this picture, they're all sort of divided over the issue. Each colony is a little bit too jealous of its own taxation powers to actually accept the plan, so it never took effect. The Albany Congress is significant, however, because it set a precedent for later, more revolutionary congresses in the 1770s. It's in London that the new British Prime Minister, William Pitt, really concentrated the government's military strategy on conquering Canada. And eventually, towards the end of the French and Indian War, they are able to take Quebec. And then after the surrender of Montreal, they come up with the Treaty of Paris, or the Peace of Paris, which would end the French and Indian War. It's through this peace treaty that Great Britain acquired both French Canada and Spanish Florida. France gave up its huge western territory of Louisiana and any claims west of the Mississippi River in compensation for Spain's loss of Florida. Its victory in the French and Indian War gave Great Britain unchallenged supremacy in North America. It also established that the country of Britain was the dominant naval power in the world. So no longer did the American colonies face the threat of concerted attacks from the French and the Spanish and their Native American allies, but they did still face the potential for attack of just independent Native Americans. The British really came away from the war with a low opinion of the colonial military effort. They sort of held this idea that the American militia was poorly trained, they're sort of disorderly. They also noted that some of the colonies had either refused to contribute troops or they weren't really contributing any money for the war. So the British sort of took this view as, okay, they take this point of view that the colonists are unable and unwilling to defend their new frontiers. They're sort of seen as these ungrateful children who want extra land, but they're not willing to commit troops or pay for the actual war. Meanwhile, the colonists will sort of take an opposite view of their military performance. They're very proud of their record in all of these wars, all 4 wars. They develop confidence that they can successfully provide for their own defense. they weren't really impressed with the British troops or with their leadership. They sort of thought that the British methods of warfare seemed kind of badly suited to America's terrain because it's so densely wooded. Really, even more serious than the resentful feelings stirred by the war was the British government's decision to change its colonial policies. Previously, Britain had exercised little direct control over the colonies. They had generally allowed navigation laws regulating colonial trade to go unenforced. That's called salutary neglect, when you pass a law but you don't really enforce it. All four wars, and especially this last one, the French and Indian War, were extremely costly. In addition, Britain now felt the need to maintain a very large British military force to guard its frontiers in the Americas. So it's among British landowners that they really felt this pressure to reduce the heavy taxes that the colonial wars had laid upon them and start putting some of those taxes on the colonists instead. King George III was the dominant political figure, and he also used Parliament to help pursue a colonial policy that would solve Britain's domestic financial problems from the 7 Years' War. They would make the American colonies bear more of the cost of maintaining the British Empire. And that's really popular among Parliament and the other dominant political leaders. The first real major test of the new British imperial policy came in 1763, when Chief Pontiac led a major attack against colonial settlements on the western frontier. The Native Americans were angered by the growing westward movement of European settlers and by the British refusal to offer gifts, as the French had often done. Pontiac's alliance of Native Americans in the Ohio Valley destroyed forts and settlements from New York all the way down to Virginia. Rather than relying on colonial forces to retaliate, the British sent troops to deal with the rebellion and then passed this other law called the Proclamation of 1763. So there's this red line on the map. This is your little imaginary line for the Appalachian Mountains. As a further measure for stabilizing the western frontier, the British government issued a proclamation that prohibited colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. Such a measure would theoretically help to prevent future hostilities between colonists and Native Americans, but the colonists reacted to the proclamation with both anger and defiance. After their victory in the French and Indian War, Americans really thought that they deserved to reap the benefits of the war in the form of access to western lands, especially lands in the Ohio River Valley. So for the British to deny them access to land in the Ohio River Valley was infuriating. Defying the prohibition, thousands streamed westward beyond the imaginary boundary line drawn by the British. You've got more attacks on American Indians, like the March of the Paxton Boys in 1764. And the Proclamation of 1763 is only the first of a series of acts by the British government